Hello, everybody. My name is Sil the DM, and I'm bringing you today's Frontier Reclamation recap titled All the Little Memories. To quickly recap, we're in the middle of a fight with a small group of giant centipedes and some cave fishers. The party had sort of gotten themselves between fleeing giant centipedes and ended up getting involved with them while their predators, their hunters, showed up, the cave fishers. The fight ended not super quickly, but quick enough. Navad got out of position trying to knock down the cave fishers, and two of them jumped down using the opportunity of the exposed tabaxi to sort of collapse on him and drop him, getting a flanking position and multi attacks. The monk does not have the health pool to sort of deal with that sort of onslaught on his own. Um, and the centipedes were all put to sleep, at least the remaining three were, by a Merrill casting a sleep spell and rolling exactsies on the health of the three centipedes. Um, you're not going to see very much of a Merrill roleplay wise today because the player wasn't here and I had to pilot them. And I refused to dedicate time out of my brain to try and play someone else's character when I have every other character to deal with. Um, So the party made quick work of the two cave fishers that fell down, or at least quick-ish work. The herd AC of the cave fishers at about 16 was proving actually pretty difficult to get through. Um, Not for someone like Shay with the great axe, but for everyone else with their rapiers and daggers, it was proving just more difficult to deal consecutive and consistent damage. But they did get them pretty weak and got to the point where they were getting bloodied, and there's sort of thin, oily substance sort of running out of their body like blood, proved to be quite flammable as Emerald used their last spell slot to just blow one of them up completely. And there was a rather funny moment where Echo flopped like their third attack in the row, this time with a -1, and they ended up getting just coated in Kingfisher blood, which made them vulnerable for fire until they could get it cleaned off. Which, wasn't relevant and didn't happen, and there was no real penalty for it, but there was the threat of something happening, and that was fun enough, I feel. They finished up the two cave fishers that had landed down, and the third, seeing how quickly it was turning against its fellow predators, decided to retreat. They took a little bit of time, mended their wounds, used what little bit of healing magic they had still lying around. Um, some potions were consumed to wake Navad up and make sure everyone was okay. And everyone sort of just got ready to go, and a little bit of prestidigitation was used by Vanya to clean up Echo, who again was coated in cave fisher blood and bile. And the party moved on for another few hours until they entered into an open cavern. Inside, there was a lot of fungus like vegetation, which was bathing the area in a faint bioluminescent light, and there's little spores coming down. Running through the middle of the cavern was about a 15-foot wide, 3-foot deep river. Inside, as they approached, they could see fish and other creatures scatter from their source of light, which was a bit brighter than the bioluminescent glow of the shrooms. In the corner of the room, grazing on the shrooms and drinking of the water, um, the party found a small herd of Roth. Really just a male bison, basically, and a few cows. Um, but they were still leery of them since, though not inherently violent, um, Roth are still, like, larger than cattle. And guess what? If a cow wants to kill you, a cow's gonna kill you because it's got the weight to do that. So they gave the animals a respectful sort of birth, not wanting to uh, come across as a threat and endanger having to try and fight down like 5 cows or some nonsense. And it was during this moment that Vaughn made a very good perception check and spotted that at the other end of the chamber there was a tunnel leaving away. It looked like a chunk of maybe some sort of uncut natural gemstone, that was a deep red, and very faintly they could hear the sound of pickaxes being used. Bringing this to everyone else's attention, everyone decided to carefully cross the river, which proved to be treacherous but no real danger, at the moment at least. And they managed to slip their way across. Vanya, however, paused at the water, not really enjoying the prospect of crossing it, um, and seeing something disturbing in their reflection in the water that sort of gave them pause, as if the reflection they had was that of someone else for a moment. But the Roth was starting to get concerned with them crossing the river to the Roth side and was starting to come over to sort of front. And Vanya was like, "All right, I'm moving," and got across. Um, Following the sound of the pickaxe, they walked into that tunnel and followed it down for about another 250 feet. As they moved, they tried to get a good look at the gemstone, but with the dim lighting and how dark vision doesn't really allow very good color comprehension, they couldn't really tell what sort of gemstone it was. They pushed their way down and eventually opened into a large alcove, or sorry, small alcove. I don't know why I said large. It was larger than the tunnel, okay, but it was much smaller than the room they were just in. It was about 40 feet wide by about 50, or sorry, 30 feet wide by about 50 feet deep. And in here they saw a human with a notebook out, sit down, cross-legged, sort of feverishly taking notes, and the two dwarven miners, who appear to be mining what almost looked like a vein of maybe silver or mithril. Um, and they were so engrossed in the work they hadn't noticed the approach of the party, the sound of the pickaxes in the river sort of draining out, the sound of not super stealthy, but also not extremely loud party. No one in the party is really wearing extremely heavy gear. There's no clanking plate mail um, or anything like that. So they can move pretty stealthily, especially where earlier Shay had cast a spell that allowed everyone to sort of pass without trace while moving over stonework, uh, sort of even more muffling their footsteps. So the party called out to them, wanting to sort of catch their attention in a non-threatening way. Um, the dwarves and the human did react very surprised and started to look for weapons and everything, but then they noticed that it was just a group of people, albeit strange, motley crew of people, because that's what D&D parties are. It's just, hey, this place has 2% other in its population. Time to be the 2%. Because that's D&D for you. Um, though, I mean, we do have a human and one other person who passes for human, so I mean they're fairly regular, um, I suppose. Everyone else is a little bit more spicy in this area, at least. Vanya being a half elf, though, is also not super common, but not super rare. But they still, it was definitely not a group of Druga or dark elves or some monster in the dark. It was a group of people, and they were caught off guard and confused, but relieved that it didn't look like it was a threat. At this point, the party was noticing that the bedrolls had sort of been laid out of these characters, and that they had their tools laid on them to keep the finer instruments sort of at ready. And it looked like they'd already mined off a large chunk of this ore. On top of that, it looked like there had been lunch tins lying around where they consumed some of the food. They spoke with each other quickly, and they were confused why a group had been sent for them. And the party let them know that it had been a few days since anyone had heard from them. And the dwarves and the human were like, a few days? We thought it's only been a few hours, like maybe 6. Oh, shit. And they were like, oh man, we need to pack. And so they started to pack up. And everyone had a bit of a laugh at that, especially some of them who have an understanding for getting consumed by work. Um, but as they were moving, there was something weird going on. The way the dwarves and the human were moving seemed a little different. And then everyone had to make an intelligence saving throw. As from one of the crevices in the back of the room, there came a sudden wave of energy, a burst. Um, no one succeeded, and they all became stunned. Um, Falling to their knees a little bit, a second wave hit, and then a third, and a fourth. And as this was happening, they slowly saw this figure pushing its way out of the crevice, oozing and pouring into the room. Red, sort of non Newtonian fluid cricking and spilling out of the crack. Um, and it was at this point, as they were beginning to fall unconscious, that many of them noticed tendrils of red ooze leading away from the two dwarves and the human towards this figure. Eventually, it entered into the room, and they saw it for what it was, this mass of red ooze with limbs and skulls floating inside of its body, um, just as everything went dark. Now, for those of you who watch all of my recaps, you might notice something similar about this encounter with the Sands of Kelemere campaign recap that went up this week. I did not intend to be using the same type of monster in both of these campaigns, but I had planned the Frontier campaign out a while ago, and at least parts of it. And this creature in particular was always going to be a part of that campaign. And I'm honestly just a huge fan of it. Now, of course, I modify it to suit my own needs. I run almost no monsters raw, uh, raw being rules as written. Um, if I'm going to use a monster in my setting, I'm probably going to fiddle with its stats. I'm probably going to fiddle with its statistics and abilities and defenses. I'm just going to fiddle with it. It's just what I do to make things fit the flow I'm trying to get more in my campaign. Um, but yes, several members in the party, their players, are also in the Sands of Calamere campaign, and did notice similarities in the way that they were attacked, which is fair. When I realized the party was going to get to Laputa in that campaign, I began plotting out what I wanted to be in Laputa and what was going on there. And probably because this creature was still on my mind, I included it. Um, I did not intend to get into Frontier and get to this monster at the same point, and I also never intended to have so many players in both of the campaigns, like who share the campaign. Um, yeah, it's just not something I normally do. I don't normally have extremely samey monsters in very very close proximity to each other in campaigns, but it just sort of happened this way. So gradually, unconscious returned through the blackness of unconsciousness. Is a better way to put what I'm trying to say. Um, the players experienced memories. They woke up for a moment, but none of them were in the right place. Everything seemed distorted, and when they tried to remember where they were, why they were, what they were doing, it hurt and proved impossible. And everyone experienced different moments of their lives over again, except for Meryl, who again wasn't here, and I wasn't just role playing that out for my own sake and the party's sake. At one point, I will discuss that with a Meryl's player, but that has not happened yet. Um, Echo, I'm doing these not in order, by the way, because I don't remember the exact order they happened in. Um, Echo experienced waking up in one of the taverns, probably their favorite tavern in the town where they were raised, sneaking out of the room to creep down quietly without waking any of the other guests, hoping to get a bit of free breakfast. Echo being an orphan who had just sort of been left at a tavern, they sort of jumped around from building to building with whoever would take them in, and the woman who ran this tavern, more than others, seemed to care for Echo quite a bit. And on Echo's way down the stairs, she stopped, hearing a loud, drunken, angry man, um, who at the time was uh, asking whether or not the bartender had you here, had Echo here, um, very derogatorily. And the man was a drunk who had opinions about the way the city was run and the orphans and how useless they were, even more useless than regular children. And he was just sort of going off on the rant. And of course, the bartender, the barmaid, was the bar owner, sorry, was defending Echo, but it really got to Echo. And there was a moment where Echo reached down and pulled out a dagger and was thinking violent thoughts. And as she crept down and got up behind the drunk, she pulled the dagger back and then quickly cut his coin purse off of his belt, and then slunk out of the building. But it was at this point that the city and the building and everything around Echo was beginning to collapse. It was at this point that Echo had to make a series of intelligence saves. Each player going through their visions ended up having to make 2 intelligence saves. Only 3 of them passed 1. Echo managed to pass one and grip a hold of the very real silver coin she had just stolen from the miner, as the world around her collapsed. And having managed to pass one save, she managed to sort of jerk back to the world of the living. Everyone else experienced their own vision. Navat was rudely awoken with a sharp kick to the head, having slumped up against one of the businesses in the city he lived in, or the town, really, to sleep, having been homeless for the most part of his youth, um, and remembered a dream of being attacked by this man, and then spending his time going to visit the monastery where he would eventually stay, um, until the darkness began to bubble up from beneath while the monks were busy working. And across all of these dreams, there were very shared motifs. People had no faces, they were just blurry, indecipherable lines. Memories of who they were, but just sort of lingering on the edge of consciousness. Um, and they all ended in very much the same way: darkness consuming the dream, and sharp, sharp pains in their head. Navat, however, is one of the ones who managed to pass their save, at least one of them. And so, as the memory began to be consumed, Navat remembered very intently the building of the monastery and the nuns, the sisters who lived there, and he tried to help them to get them away from the darkness, but as it bubbled up and rised out like a wave pushing up from underground, it overtook him. At which point we went to Vanya, the only other person out of the group to successfully pass one of their intelligence saves. Vanya remembered being pulled out of a very hot and stuffy and drunken, smoke-filled dinner party with her family and other members of importance from where she's from, pulled by the hand by a Triton, with cyan blue skin and sort of deep sea green and violet hair, wearing fine nobleman's clothes and a rapier. They were being pulled into a beautiful starry night. Um, the air was cool, but not uncomfortably so. The faces of the people they saw in and about again were muddled and featureless. And as they were being pulled along, they were talking, but the sound was being busted and nonsensical. It was at this point that Vanya passed their first intelligence save and managed to see the face of the person they were traveling with, who Vanya remembers as Cyan, or Cyan Funzel, um, their Triton fiance, uh, who was keeping close with them and talking about potential plans for the future, excitedly as they walked and journeyed closer to the woods. And it was at this point that Vanya began to have a bit of a panic attack, knowing internally where this encounter was leading to, but how different everything seemed. And gradually the darkness consumed that dream as well, until it was just Vanya and Cyan in the darkness together. Shay experienced a moment quite differently and failed both of her intelligence saves. Shay experienced a moment where she was working in a mine, just sort of giving her body to the thought, the repetitive actions. Um, and it was at this point that a earthquake occurred, low, not high magnitude, but it was enough to shift some pretty important stones, and the section of the mine that she was working began to collapse. Panic and concern sort of overtook her, and all the miners as they were attempting to flee. As they were moving out of the particular shaft they were in to get back to the main mining network, the entryway began to collapse. And it was at that moment that Shay, much larger than the dwarven miners who worked with her and the other gnomes and most of the humans, threw herself into the opening of the door and sort of steadied it with her back, holding up the doorway, refusing to let it collapse. And as all these faceless miners ran past, there was just this constant beating of darkness and weight pushing down. And for a moment, uh, the foreman called out for her, telling her to come, that everyone was gone. And in her memory, that would be when she left, when she dove out of the way of the collapsing mine shaft. But in this version of the memory, darkness consumed everything, and Shay was left holding up the darkness in intense pain. Uh, the other member of the group, because I believe there is only one more member who was present at the time, was Enhel. And Enhel, I think, might have been the first to reawaken, quote unquote. Enhel woke up in their small, dark, heavily confined space in their mother's hut. Woke up to her shouts and screams, demanding that Enhel go and gather more herbs and creatures from the forest, the jungle, not the jungle, the swampland surrounding the hut. Um, Creatures and plants that Enhel was familiar with as being things used that their mother used to produce a medicine that made Enhel quite numb, and sort of lucid, almost like an anesthetic. Um, and though it made Enhel quite afraid to think of what future experiments their mother might be planning, they were also too scared to refute her. So after being berated to go get these ingredients, Enhel stumbled their way outside into the swamp. And as they got out of the door, the swamp began to be consumed by darkness until it ate up the hut and the swamp all around Enhel, leaving Enhel alone and in intense pain. Now, it was at this point that the three players, Navat, Echo, and Vanya, who managed to make one of their two intelligence saves, woke up and realized they were in a room that was dimly lit red by a glow coming off of the ooze creature. Um, the room was larger than the one that the dwarves had been mining in, but not by much. And they noticed a few exits. One seemed to be leading back the way they would have come from in theory, and another exit leading off in a different direction. Um, Echo and Vanya managed to keep that they had woken up hidden, um, whereas Navat had sort of just full opened his eyes and react to what was around him and drew the attention of the ooze, who quickly began blasting him with psionic energy and putting him back to sleep. Vanya and Echo noticed that they were sort of being held down, that the bottom part of the ooze creature, its pseudopod like base, had sort of flattened out along the room and was weighing them down with several 100 pounds of force, just like pressed down on their chests and hands, preventing Vanya from easily being able to cast a cantrip and preventing Echo from very easily being able to access their daggers or weapons. Um, in the room, they also noticed three bodies, two dwarves and a human, who seemed to be alive but very pale, their eyes vacant, and they just seemed to be in a vegetative state, um, not too far away. They attempted to figure out what to do, Vanya slowly spending a bit of time to pull their hands free, and Echo managed to get a hold of one of their daggers and was waiting for a good opportunity to cut themselves free. About halfway through Vanya's attempts to pull their hands out, a new figure entered the room. Uh, a tall but 6'2" humanoid-like figure, just sort of gently levitating along the floor of the cavern with a long robe with a high collar, and, as Vanya noticed, tentacles coming down from the front of its face. An illithid or mind flayer. The mind flayer seemed to be communing telepathically with the ooze creature very angrily. So strong were its thoughts that everyone who was conscious, so Echo and Vanya, could sort of pick up um, not words, but empathetically sense the anger and annoyance coming from the mind flayer. And there was a bit of a confrontation. It looked like the ooze creature was sort of rebelling against the mind flayer, um, and the two of them were sort of battling against each other psionically. And it was at this point that Vanya and Echo saw the ooze like retreating and retracting a little bit, its body becoming weaker and wounded, um, as it was becoming overpowered by the mind flayer. Um, it doesn't have the creature in, if you're curious about lore, doesn't really have the ability to go directly against the elder brain or the mind flayers, um, but it was being rebellious enough that it sort of warranted punishment. And as this little confrontation was happening, another creature dragged its way into the room, a mind controlled hook horror, dragging its long claws along the floor. um, Satisfied that the Mon Flayer had put uh, the ooze creature in its place, the wounded creature, now almost half of its regular size, and sort of oozing red liquid from the eyes of the skulls along its body. Uh, it turned as the Hook Flayer gathered up the three inner bodies of the two dwarves and the human, the miners, and from within its robes produced three separate vials, and telekinetically removed their lids, revealing little snapping, wiggling worms in each, one in each, that began snapping and trying biting at each other. It then pushed the jars out to each of the three vegetative bodies, and the worms, seeing their ultimate goal, jumped towards the dwarves and the human and began burrowing their way into their skull through their ears. Vanya managed to keep control of themselves through all of this, and Echo really couldn't see what was happening, as this was across the room through the ooze and the mind flayers. So Echo didn't really get a good look at this, but Vanya was having it happen right in front of them. And once the illithid worms had dug their way in, the Hookor, under the instruction of the Mind Flayer, turned and began leaving. And the Mind Flayer began leaving as well, and paused for a moment as if it had sensed something, um, but pushed on anyways. At this point, the ooze creature wiggled to the center of the room and seemed very intent on where the Mind Flayer had went, sort of distracted for a moment. And that was where everything burst into action. Echo leapt out of its position and attempted to attack the creature, actually managing to miss, which sadly will happen to Echo quite a bit. Um, and seeing that Echo was moving, Vanya hopped to action as well, having managed to get their hand free just as the Mind Flayer was about to leave. Um, both of them on their feet now. Vanya used a moment to sort of run around the room in an effort to wake people up, stomping on uh, a lot of people. Everyone except Navat ended up awake at this point. And we engaged this ooze creature in full combat. Um, we'll just sort of move over it, as the combat was basically the rest of the session without too much happening. Um, Navat spent most of the encounter asleep, as with Vanya's movement, they were only able to wake everyone but Navat in a single movement. And at that point, they sort of got engaged in the fight. The ooze creature seemed to be heavily resistant to psionic attacks, as well as blunt and slashing weapons. They just seemed to do very little damage against the creature. Um, I think piercing as well. I think a few piercing weapons were thrown at this thing at some point. Um, And at one point, it opened up that sort of anglerfish ability to create a humanoid like shape. Um, and this is sort of like the worst encounter for the ooze because this creature really wants to lure away people, basically, um, and manipulate them and fight from a distance with psionic abilities. But in this case, it was a very tight room where it's in the middle instead of the previous tight room where it was at the entrance and able to psychic blast into the room and hit everybody. Here, it had to sort of angle its attacks, and it was having a much harder time of it. So it created that body to try and give itself a little bit of leeway, creating the body in the form of Seinfeld, um, Vanya's fiance, who quickly grappled Vanya and pinned them, sorry, against the wall, grabbing their throat, um, choking them, and holding them steady for the ooze to use its slam attack, just bash against Vanya, nearly dropping them. Um, Angel managed to kill that version of the anglerfish Bob with their crossbow, as everyone else began working on the ooze itself. At which point, the ooze resummoned another sort of tendril, reshaping it in the form of Angel's mother, a green skinned, sort of tautly skinned, fey looking creature with long claws and spindly hands, extremely long, smooth white hair on a black robe. Which gave people some concern, especially Angel, who ended up getting raked across the face by the claws of this figure before um, the fight continued, and Angel managed to destroy that angler eventually. Um, it took quite a while, the Angel struggling with the image of his mother, however. And during this time, the rest of the fight continued. Vanya eventually managed to wake up Navat, who ran in, shattered their quarterstaff against the creature, and then threw in some punches, and then immediately went down after a psychic blast from the ooze. Um, Echo had spent about 3 rounds of the fight stunned as well, having failed in the ooze's initial psionic blast. And this was where I just flopped the recharge roll. I think there were 4 turns in a row, full 4 rounds, where I rolled 1, 1, 1, and 2 on the recharge for the psionic blast. So the ooze's strongest tool that could theoretically let it take out 2 people of the fight a turn just never happened again. And I was like, the party was just extremely lucky. And eventually they were managing to get it quite wounded, and it seemed to start panicking, and noticing that because of how much damage it had taken when dealing with the Mind Flayer, and its little punishment for its rebellious outburst, it wasn't at full capacity to begin with. It was already pretty wounded, and it's already not a full grown one of these creatures. It's a young version of this creature. And even with its resistances to almost all the damage the party threw at it, except for one spell, with a Meryl converting some sorcery points into a chromatic orb, um, it was still losing the fight, and it wasn't regaining its psychic ability. We could flavor that to the stress and panic it was in. So it seemed to start communicating telepathically, like it was starting to send a message. And it was at this point that it was so low that everyone was just struggling as hard as they could to get through its bubbly hide and deal the last bit of damage. When Echo finally did the last point of damage, because I believe Vanya had dropped it to 1 hit point, um, that we ended the session, as we were already about 2 minutes late, and I desperately had to go take care of some things before work that night because I've done a lot of overtime this past week. Um, and I might take a week off and then do another week of overtime. Who knows? But that was the session. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me in the comments with them. I'm always interested to converse about the setting and what's going on. Just a little footnote. I don't believe I mentioned it, but Vanya did reach level 2 during the encounter with the cave fishers. However, they did not hit level 3 after dealing with this creature. Not yet. We'll see how they manage to get out of this situation first. Um, I want to thank everyone for coming by. Have a great day.